The truth of the Yoshiwara pleasure district isn't found in the delicate woodblock prints. It's in the stench of cheap perfume failing to mask syphilis sores, the metallic tang of blood from a back alley abortion mingling with the filth of open sewers, and the suffocating odor of despair rising from thousands of young girls sold into a living tomb. They called it the floating world, a realm of fantasy and sophisticated pleasure. What a poetic name for a stockyard where human cattle were fattened, used, and slaughtered for the convenience of the ruling class. You've been sold a fairy tale of the elegant Oiran, the high-class courtesans who were masters of art and chose their own patrons. It's a shimmering, beautiful lie painted over a chasm of rot. For every celebrated Oiran, there were 1,000 nameless girls in the cheaper brothels, locked in literal cages and displayed like cuts of meat for any drunken brute with a few coins. These were children, some as young as 7, bought from starving peasants and broken like wild horses. Their bodies weren't temples of art. They were public utilities, rented out until they collapsed from disease, abuse, or the sheer, grinding horror of their existence. The artists, the poets, the playwrights, they were all complicit. They were the propaganda wing of this industrial-scale human trafficking operation, turning a nightmare of sexual slavery into a fashionable aesthetic. They painted the cage but called it a beautiful garden. But this vile hypocrisy wasn't just an artistic choice, it was the entire point. The beauty was the anesthetic, designed to numb you to the horror just beneath the surface. It was a system, a machine, built on a foundation of broken bodies and shattered souls. So how did they perfect this engine of depravity? And who were the monsters who held the keys? The answer is so much filthier than the open sewers that ran through Yoshiwara's streets. Let's name the monsters. Let's strip away their respectable titles and see them for what they were. Human traffickers, predators, and pimps hiding behind the authority of the state. The architect-in-chief was the Tokugawa shogunate itself. Don't let the history books fool you with talk of social order and controlling vice. The shogun, Ieyasu Tokugawa, didn't create Yoshiwara to contain prostitution. He created it to centralize, regulate, and profit from it. He was the godfather of a state-sponsored crime syndicate. He and his successors built a walled ghetto, not to protect the city from the filth, but to ensure no single piece of human property could escape. It was a prison, and the shogun was the warden. Every transaction, every sale of a young girl, every brutal contract filled the government's coffers and kept the restless samurai class sedated and distracted. Then you have the true jackals on the ground, the brothel owners, the Zagan. These weren't hapless businessmen. They were predators of the highest order. Men who would travel to famine-stricken villages and persuade starving parents to sell their daughters for a handful of rice, promising a life of glamour and ease. They spoke of fine silks and warm beds, while knowing they were delivering these children to a short, brutal life of sexual servitude and disease. They were the ones who drafted the contracts, the masterpieces of legalistic evil that trapped women in insurmountable debt. A girl's debut wasn't a celebration. It was the moment the chains were locked. The cost of her kimono, her food, her makeup, even the bribes paid to officials, were all added to her debt, a debt that grew faster than she could ever hope to repay it. It was a life sentence. And let's not forget the complicit madams, you're right, often former prostitutes themselves, who had survived the system only to become its most vicious enforcers. These were women who had climbed a ladder of corpses to find a sliver of power. They were the ones who beat the new girls into submission, who inspected them for disease like livestock, who forced them to drink abortifacient herbs that tore their insides apart, and who taught them that their only value was the price they could fetch for a night. They were the living embodiment of the system's cruelty, survival by collaboration, a final, soul-crushing corruption. These weren't just individuals. They were cogs in a machine. But a few monsters acting in the shadows is one thing. What happens when they turn their personal sickness into the law of the land? What happens when the entire mechanism of power exists only to feed their perverse desires? That's where the real nightmare begins. How did they get away with it? They built a machine, a perfect, self-sustaining engine of filth called the Nenki Boko, the indentured servitude contract. And it was a work of pure, unadulterated evil. When a starving farmer sold his 7-year-old daughter to a Zegan, he wasn't just selling her for a few years. He was signing her death warrant. The contract, typically for 10 years, was a legal fiction. From the moment she arrived, the girl was drowning in manufactured debt. The cost of the extravagant clothes she was forced to wear, the food she ate, the roof over her head. It was all tallied against her earnings. But her earnings were a pittance, a tiny fraction of what the customer paid. The rest went straight into the brothel owner's pocket. It was a system designed for one purpose: to ensure the debt could never be repaid. The 10-year contract would inevitably be extended again and again until the girl was too old, too sick, or too broken to be of any use. The very geography of Yoshiwara was part of the machine. It was a walled fortress surrounded by a moat, with a single, heavily guarded gate. This wasn't to keep customers out, it was to keep the women in. Escape was a fantasy. Any girl caught trying to flee, a crime known as ashi nuke, was subjected to a punishment of unimaginable cruelty. She would be savagely beaten, her feet possibly maimed, and then tied up and displayed in the brothel's main room as a warning to the others. Her shame was a tool of control. Her terror was part of the business model. The state, the shogunate, fully endorsed this. They weren't just turning a blind eye. Their guards manned the gate. They were active partners in this slave trade. This engine of corruption ran on the complicity of an entire society. The customers, the samurai, the merchants, the artisans, all knew. They saw the young girls. They saw the despair in their eyes, and they chose to see a fantasy. The families who sold their daughters told themselves it was a noble sacrifice, a way for their child to eat white rice every day, ignoring the reality of what that rice was paid for. The law, the culture, the art, it all worked in concert to normalize this abomination. They had built a perfect, self-sustaining engine of exploitation. But every machine, when pushed to its limit, either breaks down or explodes. And an explosion was coming, an event so vile it would make everything that came before it look like child's play. This was the day the mask finally burned off. In 1855, the Great Ansei earthquake struck Edo, modern-day Tokyo. It was a cataclysm of fire and death. But for the women of Yoshiwara, the shaking ground wasn't the real terror. The real terror was the locked gate. As fires raged and consumed the wooden city, the brothel owners and officials made a decision that exposed the system's rotten core for all to see. They refused to open the main gate. Why? Because their property might escape in the chaos. The women trapped inside the walled district were faced with an impossible choice: burn to death or drown in the moat trying to flee. Hundreds died. They were screaming, trapped, pounding on the locked gate as the flames closed in, while their owners prioritized profit over human life. Their deaths weren't a tragedy. They were a business expense. This wasn't an isolated incident. Fires were a constant threat in a city made of wood and paper. After each blaze, Yoshiwara was rebuilt, often more grandly than before, on the ashes of the women who had perished. But the ultimate point of no return wasn't a single fire. It was the institutionalized policy of disposability that these events laid bare. It was the moment the pretense of care, of offering a life, was incinerated, revealing the cold, hard truth. These women were not considered human. They were assets to be protected only as long as they were profitable, and utterly disposable the moment they became a liability. The entire social contract was revealed as a fraud. There was no protection, there was no escape. There was only the cage, and when the cage caught fire, you were expected to burn with it. The authorities saw the charred bodies, they heard the stories of the horror, and what did they do? Nothing. They allowed the district to be rebuilt, the contracts to be rewritten, and the machine to restart, more efficient than ever. They had consciously decided that the lives of thousands of women were worthless compared to the smooth functioning of their system of sexual control and commerce. They had crossed the line. The pact with the devil was signed in the ashes of nameless women. But all of this, the debt, the beatings, the fires, was just a rehearsal for their final masterpiece of cruelty. What they did next wasn't just a crime. It was an abomination against humanity itself. When the screams finally faded, when the diseases had eaten away their bodies, when their youth was a distant, bitter memory, what happened to the women of Yoshiwara? You won't find the answer in the glamorous prints. For that, you have to go to a place called Jōkan-ji. They called it the Nagakomi-dera, the throwaway temple, and it is the single most honest monument to Yoshiwara in existence. When a prostitute died in debt, which was almost all of them, the brothel owner wouldn't waste a single coin on a proper burial. A funeral was for people. These women were refuse. So their bodies were stripped naked, stuffed into cheap straw mats or barrels, and carted off in the dead of night to Jōkan-ji. There they were unceremoniously dumped into a mass grave, without a name, without a prayer, without a shred of dignity. Just meat, tossed onto a pile of other rotting meat. Can you imagine the scene? The silent cart rolling through the dark streets, carrying its grim cargo. The bored, indifferent men who did the work, heaving the anonymous bodies into a pit. The stench of decay that must have hung over that place, a permanent miasma of forgotten lives. This was the true end of the line in the floating world. Not a peaceful passing, but an anonymous disposal. While a celebrated Oiran might receive a lavish funeral to uphold the district's public image, the vast majority of her sisters ended their journey as garbage. The temple itself became a repository of horror, the final, silent witness to the system's ultimate logic. You are born worthless, you are sold, you are used until you break, and then you are thrown away like trash. This wasn't a secret. It was an open, accepted practice. It was the final turn of the screw, the ultimate expression of contempt. The beauty of Yoshiwara was a lie constructed to hide this pit. The poetry, the music, the art. It was all a lullaby sung to distract from the sound of bodies being thrown into the earth. It is estimated that over 25,000 women were disposed of in this way at Jōkan-ji alone. A mountain of bones, each one a story of a stolen childhood and a brutal life. And when the carnage was over, a terrible silence fell. But in that silence, a new horror was born. The lie. The desperate, pathetic attempt to bury the bodies and rewrite the story. But you cannot bury the truth. And the truth that crawled out of that mass grave was even more monstrous than the massacre itself. Every monster fears the dawn. And the dawn was supposedly coming for them. The Meiji Restoration arrived, bringing with it a veneer of Western-style modernity. Laws were eventually passed in the 20th century to officially abolish prostitution. Yoshiwara, the great, glittering cesspit, was finally closed. A victory for human rights, you might think. A reckoning for the monsters. What a joke. There was no justice. The brothel owners, rich from generations of exploitation, simply rebranded. They opened cafes and restaurants, where the same practices continued under a different name. The system didn't die. It just went underground, metastasizing into new forms. The government that abolished it was the same institution that had profited from it for centuries. The punishment for the architects of this hell was that they got to keep their money. But the most insidious part of the legacy wasn't the continuation of the trade. It was the victory of the lie, the poison. The history of Yoshiwara was aggressively whitewashed. The art, the stories, the romantic kabuki plays, that became the official memory. The mass grave at Jōkan-ji was forgotten. The debt slavery, the abuse, the dead children, All of it was scrubbed from the record, replaced by the fantasy of the floating world. The victims were erased, and their torment was repackaged as an exotic cultural experience for tourists and history buffs. The ultimate hypocrisy is that the culture that devoured these women now curates their memory, ensuring we only see the beautiful mask, never the screaming face beneath. In the end, their empire of filth crumbled. But their legacy? Their legacy is a poison that still seeps into the ground we walk on today. It's in every story that romanticizes sexual exploitation, in every culture that values female beauty over female humanity, in every instance where we consume art without asking about the blood that was spilled to create it. Yoshiwara taught the world a lesson, not about justice, but about how effectively a society can package and sell its own depravity. And if you think their time is over, if you think we've learned anything at all, you haven't been paying attention.